I'm now going to continue the build with bag number 4, which is the steering system and the top deck. We got a lot of parts in here. Just gonna put these screws in here. First thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna put these turnbuckles together, which is a bit time consuming, but nonetheless has to be done. So I can really recommend using the hoodie turnbuckle tool to put these together. It's a big help. I'm gonna start with the steering links. Keep in mind here that you need to use the smaller diameter ball cups for the inside of the steering links, the part which mounts onto the steering. I'm going to use the 4mm turnbuckle wrench to put these together. I usually just make a rough estimate of the length of these, and then I perfect the length when I set the steering system up, when I set the toe out and so on. Then you can of course use this turnbuckle tool. It will make this process a lot easier. One side done, I'm gonna do the other side. Again, the big ball cup goes on the outside of the steering link. The small one goes on the inside. And this is the small ball cup, and then it means that it goes on the inside of the steering link. I'm gonna put this all together here. And that's the other steering link done, and finally we're gonna put the shorter steering link together, which goes to the servo. For this we're gonna use these two ball cups here. And this is a 3mm turnbuckle, so you have to use the 3mm turnbuckle tool for this specific link and part of the steering. So we install this turnbuckle here. Then the short one on the other side. And this link that connects the servo to the steering, we're gonna make it as short as possible, which I'm gonna explain later why when we set up the steering system. And that's done as well. If you decide to use a servo saver, I'm gonna put this together as well. Need to put these rings on here in the order of the ring with small ears on it first, and then the smallest ring after that, and then the next size of ring. Finally, the biggest ring. So you need to put these on in the right order, one by one. Push them all in place there. And finally, the little plastic covering. Then you need to choose the servo spline depending on what servo type you're using. So for my specific car here, I'm gonna use the spline which is for Futaba, which is 25 tooth spline. So that's for Futaba, Savux, Highest, and a few other brands. If you're using Sanwa or K or Propo, you need to use the one which is marked K, which is 23 tooth of spline. We're now going to put the steering system of the X4 together. It's a steering system which is fairly similar to the one on the T4, but it has some notable differences. First of all, the steering arms that are included are now the aluminum version, which is the preferred version and is used by the team for all conditions. So at first we're gonna install the bearings into the steering arms. It's really tight. But only on one side. Just put the bearings in on one side because we are going to install these little shims in between, which remove the radial play inside of the steering. So we put these shims inside of the steering arm in between the two bearings. Put the bearings in there. So always put these shims in before you put on the outer bearing. When that is done, you can put them on the little steering posts. Make sure they have free movement. Same goes for the other side. You need to keep in mind that steering arms are now in the other direction compared to the T4. So the whole steering assembly has been lowered, which means that the high part of the steering arm goes upwards and not downwards. So it's a different orientation of the steering on the X4. I'm gonna give you a little tech tip here that you can use these optional aluminum shims. Aluminum shims and screw all in one from XRAY. They are a real nice optional part which you can install on top of the steering assembly here to remove the radial play. And these just simply go on there. I'm actually gonna install them on my car now. Put these on here, we tighten this part down. The same for this part here. Put these optional screws on top of the steering arms. Steering arms are done. And then we're gonna proceed to install the steering bridge to the arms. So the steering bridge now goes on top of these arms, not at the bottom like on the T4. So, what is important here is to add a little bit of thread lock to the aluminum part to prevent the screws from coming loose. So I'm just gonna add a little bit of thread lock there. This is medium strength thread lock that I'm using. Add a little bit to the aluminum part there to prevent them from getting loose. Steering bridge goes in this orientation, so this extension here goes towards the bottom. Put the screw inside. And we simply tighten this down. Make sure you have free movement here. Same for the other side. Screw first. And we can add a bit of Hoodie bearing oil to these small bearings as well. And to the bearings in the steering itself. And we're then gonna install the short steering link to the center of the steering. I'm gonna use this short ball cap here, ball stud, sorry. Put this at the center of the steering. Actually, we're gonna use the Hoodie multi-tool for this ball cap installation. It will be a lot easier. So what we do is we put this ball stud on here, on the multi-tool. And then we just, I got the wrong one. We're gonna use the bigger diameter one, because these smaller diameter ones are for the smaller ball caps, which go onto the steering assembly. So this ball cap goes onto this ball stud here. It's easy to install with the help of the multi-tool. Then we install this short steering link to the center of the steering here. No shim needed. And then steering links, as I explained earlier, these have a smaller diameter ball stud required because they are smaller ball caps. The reason why they're smaller is that they need to have clearance to each other when they're sitting on a steering rack like this. So again, we're going to use this fantastic tool for these ball studs to go into the ball caps. That's one done. Next one done as well. So for the initial setting for the Ackerman, we're gonna use no shims, which will give you quite a lot of Ackerman, so it will make the car easy to drive. If you need to increase the steering of the car, you should add shims to the steering rack between the links and the steering. This will reduce the Ackerman effect, which will make the car more difficult to drive, but it will increase the steering of the car. So in this case, no shims for our initial setting. Steering assembly is put together. You then have the option to use the included servo saver or optional servo horn on the steering. Servo saver has the benefit of saving the servo in case of a hard crash, so you don't damage your servo. But the benefit of the servo horn is that the steering will be a lot more direct and you'll have more high-speed steering, which is especially important for high levels of competition. But if you're racing on a club level, I can really recommend using the servo mount because it will save your servo in case of a crash. But the team drivers often use the Hoodie servo horn. This is the clamp type that I have here. And it means that it's clamped down by a small screw, so it's fixed in two places. But there's several different versions available from Hoodie for all types of servos. So we're gonna install this ball stud on the servo with 4mm of shims. It goes in the top hole of the servo saver. And then again, you can just push this ball cap in place here. And that's it. The servo saver and the steering assembly is all put together. And is ready to go on the car. Another thing which is important to install on the steering is the steering lock limiting shim, which now installs from the bottom of the steering. And what I mean by that is that you install this shim at this spot here. The included shim is a 7.5mm diameter shim, which limits the steering lock to approximately 26 or 27 degrees of steering lock. But if you want to use more physical steering lock, you can purchase the optional 7mm of diameter shim, which will make it possible to use more steering lock, more physical steering lock on the car. And if you don't use this shim at all, if you leave it out, you can achieve up to 30 degrees of steering lock, which is the maximum. But we generally don't recommend using that much. We recommend to limit the steering lock to either the kit setting, which is 26 or 27 degrees, or to use the optional 7mm diameter shim, which gives you up to 28 degrees. We don't like to use any more steering lock than that, because it will just slow down the car in the corner, and it will really be hurting your cornering speed. So those are my suggestions for the steering lock shim. So we're going to continue the build of the X4 by installing the steering system that we just built onto the chassis. So it's quite simple. You just put it on here at the front part of the car, and we're going to install it with countersunk screws from the bottom. So put these screws here, and now we can use the Hoodie 4mm turnbuckle wrench to hold the steering posts in place when we tighten this down so that they're perfectly tight. The same goes for the other side. Then again, we use the turnbuckle wrench to hold the steering post to make sure that it's perfectly tightened down. Make sure that everything is moving freely. And now I'm just going to demonstrate an option part, which is the graphite steering bridge. And this steering bridge is a nice option because you can install it between the two steering posts. So it goes right here between the steering posts to stiffen up the steering assembly. And this steering bridge will make the car more reactive. You'll get more initial steering, and it's often used by team drivers for certain conditions. So just for you to know, if you're looking for more initial steering, you can try to use this graphite steering bridge. But now I'm gonna put back the optional aluminum steering screws on top of the steering. Steering is installed. We're now gonna install the top deck. This is the kit top deck that we have spoken about in the top deck flex video. So I'm not tightening down these screws yet, I'm just lining up the top leg before we have all screws in there, and then we can start thinking about how to tighten it down. I'm going to install the screw and the bearing for the top leg, which is one of the flex options which I mentioned earlier. And then when everything is on there, I'm starting to tighten these screws down from inside and out. So the screws that are the closest to the center of the car first, and then the outer ones. And also make sure that this screw here for the bearing is tight. And that's it, all those parts are in place.